Here, ladies and gentlemen, if you feel like dancing, you don't need an outfit to get up and dance with the intertribals. This is a song and dance for all tribes.
I think it's the aura of 6,000 years of continuous habitation and use by people that's here. You can feel the history, so I think that's what's special. And we know it wasn't a burial site. We know that for sure. We just know it was a special gathering site, and that in the past, many wonderful things happened. And I often think of our interracial relationships today. And in Saskatchewan, we have a big problem. Two populations, First Nation, non-First Nation, rubbing most of the time, not touching all the time. And I think 7 great nations came here and hunted and gathered. So one of the things people feel at this special place is a sense of harmony.
And just listen to the silence. Isn't that? I mean, everybody. So we were competing with architects from Ottawa and different places, and when they picked us to do the project, oh, we were so excited about this. You know, right away after the excitement of getting the project, we thought, oh, now we've got to do this really important project, and we better do it right. And so that adds to the aura of your feelings of walking around the site. So of course we felt it was very special the whole time we were out here. And then, depending on who you're walking with, it changes your perceptions too. Ernie Walker will always tell you the stories from 6,000 years ago. Oh, this is what happened here, and see this rock, you know, it could have been this.
Well, I'm here to tell you no jade masks, no Phoenician ores, no gold. Northern Plains archaeology is the story of buffalo hunters, so of course you find a lot of bone scrap, a lot of stone tool manufacturers, so you're going to see all the waste from their process of manufacturing stone tools, a lot of broken stone tools. Sometimes you get the odd one that was lost or tossed away. If we're lucky, we'll find hearth features, burned areas, and we try to get seeds and we try to extract botanicals out of those. So it's a range of things pretty much related to their normal subsistence behavior. We don't find a lot of more ceremonial artifacts or things like that. It's just, this is a campsite, this is a living area, and so everything related to their domestic activities is what we'd expect to find. What you're seeing is a University of Saskatchewan Department of Archaeology field school, which runs every year. There are 24 students this year enrolled in the class, and they get 7 weeks of fairly intensive field experience. Excavations, we've done some survey work and so forth. So they started here some 5 weeks ago, right up at the sod level. And so they've been doing very careful excavations of 1 meter squares, and they are down now at about 60 centimeters below the surface and into levels that are over 5,000 years old. And just found this just now. And that is very typical of 5,000 to 5,500 years. That was fortuitous. It's a projectile point, it's a dart tip. So you can see it's broken, the tip's broken off of it, but that's what we do. We're dealing with the stuff that the people that were living here left behind. And you got over 5,000 years of occupation at 60 centimeters, and the levels are quite close together. So you got to make sure you're not digging through one level and into the next. Could be thousands of years apart, and you're starting to mix artifacts. So it's really good for us when we find artifacts, diagnostic artifacts like this. I can tell you roughly how old it is just by looking at it, and it matches the radiocarbon dates that we have for the individual levels. So the science part of it all starts to come together. Now the guy that found this thinks he's getting it on Oprah and David Letterman, so I'm going to let you, Steve, tell him he's not.
With some of the elders, when you walk around with them, it's much more, oh, listen to the silence. And it's a spiritual kind of experience.
Sort of. I think it's probably in the valley, because I remember when we used to have sweat lodge ceremonies, very powerful there. And my favorite place is also the medicine wheel, because it's sacred. I always want to go up on that hill because it's a high ground, but I don't get there very often because it's a long walk.
So every time you walk the site with a different person from a different perspective, it would change your feeling about it. And so for us, I mean, it was very special. Yeah, we did spend a lot of time out here.
The park started out as an archaeology project. When I used to come out here to help the old landowner, and of course I'd roam around, I could find artifacts coming out of every cut bank. Every erosional surface had something in it. The idea was, of course, that it's a good science project. It has more archaeological sites than probably any place altogether in Saskatchewan. So a phenomenal resource, especially since it's right next door to a major urban area. Well, it started out as a science project, but it kind of got out of hand. We figured there has to be some way of saving this. It could be developed. The city is rapidly encroaching on it. There were private developments that we're talking about, a condominium development, for instance, and so the idea was we've got to save it. And that spurred the idea of having some kind of an educational facility. We have to turn this into a park in order to save it. And that was the birth of Wanuskewin Heritage Park as it became to be known.
The interpretive center itself wasn't established until the founding group, including the founding elders, had a sweat in the valley and said, let's have a sweat and decide what needs to happen at the park. And when they came out of that lodge, they knew they had to build a building here. And the concept of Wanuskewin being a place for all colors of people and all nations to come and learn about First Nations people was established at that time.
We had a lot of debate on whether we should build a building, for one thing. Some of the elders says, no, keep it natural, it's sacred, we're not supposed to touch it, you know, we leave it as it is. And then others, I was on that side, I said, no, it's time we educated the non-Indian people of what our culture is, what our spirituality is, they don't know anything about us, And so this debate went on for 2 or 3 meetings. Finally, we decided that we have to build a building and have an interpretive center and try and educate the public of what our history is like.
The original farm site was there in the barn and the usual things that are at a farm. And so that had been quite disturbed. I mean, for years tractors had been driving around, and so the assumption was that the main building would be in the spot that had already been most disturbed, and that way we would keep the rest of the site as natural as we could. The site would have been dramatically different. I think, and the experience of the site would have been quite different too. That was quite close to the river at that point, and I think people would have found that their attention was taken away from the resource of the medicine wheel and drawn to the river, which is the big valley. And the real story of Wanuskewin is the small valley. All over Saskatchewan there's these little tributaries that come off the big river valley, and that's where the people spent their winters. It was one of the architects from Moriama's office from Ontario that actually worked with us in sort of helping to interpret this in the context of the earlier 100-year vision that firm had developed. And he was out from Toronto walking around with us and with some of the First Nations elders, and seeing the site for the first time. And as we walked around, we crawled through some fences, we're pulling the barbed wire apart. And our Toronto architect thought this was really fun. We're pulling wire apart, going through the prairie. I've done this for a while. Snagged his pants, just perfect. And the sense immediately of this group, without a lot of discussion, was that this spot right here felt pretty good. The only problem was it wasn't on property that Meewasin actually owned. It wasn't part of the site. So we then went back and reported to the Meewasin board, and the board was very supportive, and they negotiated with the adjacent landowner to get the extra property that really made the building work. Yeah, you can see how these building designs change here. This one was an underground building. Here's one of the underground buildings. So we had to go down this channel underground, and then everything here was underground, and so we were kind of come out on these little patios popping out of the side of the hillside, and it just didn't have any of the volume that you're seeing here.
They came over and they presented the first drawing of this, proposed building, and it was something like it smashed in. It's kind of a molehill with doors outside. I remember because they presented this, on the screen the usual way, consultants and architects operate. You know, they make this big presentation, and there was just silence in the room. You know, there wasn't. You know, and I was sitting there, and we all looked at each other. And the elders, especially the old, you know, the ones we really looking up to, the older ones, they just sat quietly, you know, and then we knew there was something wrong. And then one of the veterans was there. Well, he was a veteran elder, and he said, you know, finally they all looked at it. Finally he said, it looks like a bunker, you know, in Europe. One of those German bunkers, I guess. And then the whole room laughed, you know, and then we started. And then that's when we said, oh, wow. Of course, the architect would say, well, what do you want? And, well, it's got to look like this, you know, it's got to shape it like a teepee, you know. It's got to be up there, it's got to look like First Nations, you know. And it's got to be circular, as much circular as possible, you know.
We had been working on this underground concept. We had been told that it wasn't really coming together. It just didn't feel right. And we had this meeting the next day, and we were working away in one direction. None of us felt it was quite right. So Lawrence spent all night. He was up from, I think, 6 at night, worked all night. He was up at 6 in the morning when I came back to the office, and he had developed this concept, which is very much like what you see here today. It happened almost in one day. It was a kind of a model of rough cardboard that was constructed and slapped together to show the idea of this thing. And when we trotted this out and put it in front of the First Nations people, it was kind of a comfort that just happens. It isn't really expressed directly. It just, yeah, that seems to be the direction we'd like to see.
Initially, the idea was to bury it, to make the building less obtrusive. That changed to make it, again, almost cathedral-like. If you see the spires, some people think that that's meant to mimic a teepee, these conical towers of the building. I like to think it's an abstract teepee too. I'm not so sure the architect had that in mind.
We like to keep the teepee form in the way that it is, and even the entrance that's set up like a teepee does that in a very traditional way. But the idea of making a building that responds to that begins to break that back to basic elements, which is the profile of the teepee on the horizon. I mean, the really strong form that you see with the poles coming up in the air. You know, you get sticks that come off at different angles. You know, the openness of the venting is almost like an embracing thing. They typically will face east to organize the wind, or maybe south, depending on the wind direction. And so it's those profiles that we thought were important. The 4 cardinal points are reflected very deliberately as 4 points. But I think it was very important because the cardinal points were the 4 reflections of the north, south, east, west directions that all 5 language groups unequivocally agreed on and felt was extremely important for the long-term traditions of all of the First Nations people that moved through this part of the prairies. When you're driving in, the very first thing you get from your car access to the project is aligning up, looking right through those cardinal points. And that's an important part of the experience. So it starts the minute you drive your car onto the site. You can see that there's something happening with the 4 points.
So interpretation is starting basically right as you get out of your vehicle or right as you arrive at the park. And that's to recreate animals running towards a buffalo jump. So you see the origin story, the buffalo emerging out of a ribstone, out of a large rock. You see a male and a female and a young bison running towards the building. Then you see human figures, a young woman figure waving a hide, trying to stampede those animals, and a male figure wearing a bison cloak, enticing or leading the animals towards the building. The building's actually built right on an actual bison drive line. Just to the east of the building is a real buffalo jump.
Things must flow kind of in a clockwise orientation, follow the orientation of the sun, and most of our sort of Western arrangements, you drive towards the right, and then you turn towards the left. Even grocery stores tend to work that way. So we had to think in terms of a different orientation. So if you look at the drop-off, it's backwards from what we normally do. And that's how the school children are going to be dropped off. And we didn't want to do it right at the front door because it's important that they burn off a little energy. We had some discussions with Wolfson, and they had experience with kids as well. So the buses will typically drop the kids a little bit further away from the site, and they'll come thundering down here just like the buffalo. And by the time they get to the door, hopefully they've lost a little bit of that energy, and they're prepared to listen to the message and the story that the building kind of represents.
And then once you get inside the building, one of the first things you'll see is a massive shaman figure, a shaman holding up a bison skull, calling the animals towards the jump, or calling, I like to think, calling people into the building. So there's a lot of symbolism built into the building.
The finishes are really quite interesting. The use of glass here was done very deliberately to try and keep this as transparent as you can. Concept that reflected the drive run of the buffalo down the main gallery and then right over the cliff into the kill zone. And we wanted to keep that as open as possible. So all you're seeing is the columns, and the glazing has no mullions, there's no frames, it's just open glass, and then the wood columns. So it feels, from our perspective, as close as you can within the constraints of building technology to opening this up and just making it feel as if it's kind of a canopy of trees or natural elements as you kind of enter the facility.
Initially, that building was designed with steel girders, but elders have had a lot of control over what goes on in the park. And so they were the ones that asked for wood. And so the large, massive glulam beams that you see in the Interpretive Center, which were brought in from British Columbia at some considerable expense, were again to meet not only the elders' demands, but to keep it as natural as possible.
Whenever I look at these columns and all the joints and beam connections, I always think of Wayne Lutzko in our office, because he spent hours working with the Westland people and doing all of this detailing that pulls this together. You almost get the pattern of a leaf up on top of here. So there's a lot of natural elements that are kind of hidden within the characteristics of these four cardinal points that have expressed the building. The restaurant and the main interpretive meeting space were the two primary areas in the program that involved people. It made sense to take the interpretive building, tuck it back inside, and have that as a dark area with no windows. But this is the main resource of the valley, so we wanted to put the people right out on that edge, and the restaurant is strung out along that, and it almost reflects that with the curved glass that mirrors the feeling of the valley.
The exhibit hall itself is another story. In our renewal process for our new exhibit spaces, we've talked a lot about how that came together. Well, they had the 7 tribal nations and they wanted to tell a story, but they weren't able to look at it in the same detail at that time. They were under a time constraint. They had 7 groups. How are we going to do this? So they told a basic story of the people and the buffalo and things that would happen.
The building is architecturally beautiful, yes, but it's not the most important thing in the park. It's half the story. The other half is the outside, and you have to come out and see the hills and see the creek valley. You need to go down the trails. The natural history is just as important as the human history, so to see the wildflowers and all the rest of the native vegetation, I think, is hugely important. So it's the opposite side of the same coin, the built structure, but then of course the non-built structure on the outside as well. And the two together, I think, are very powerful. You can find a lot of museums in urban context. What you don't get is that outdoor part of the story.
The research that people had done around interpretive centers suggested that, I found this interesting, 80% of the people will never actually leave the building. Only 20% actually go out and walk around and do the broader interpretive aspects of the site. So we wanted to maybe increase that number a bit if we could, get people walking out on the trails. Oh yeah, this is something Ernie Walker probably talked about, the various special spots in the whole site. And you can see here's where the building is, and here's where the main activity area is, the amphitheater, but all of these spots are here. And there's the medicine wheel way over here with that barn here. So if you'd had a building here back from the water, that would have been a very different experience of Wanuskewin. And from the restaurant, you wouldn't be able to see the valley. And so for those people, hopefully it's not 80%, but maybe we can get that number down to 60 or 65% that don't actually leave the building. We want them to be able to see the valley. And here you can really do that, at least get out on the terrace and experience the site somewhat. Why don't I take you outside and we can have a look at some of the outside features. As you leave the building, you're oriented to the site. I mean, you're not seeing the building. As soon as you leave the building, you're looking at the site, And you're directed down into the site in a natural flow. There's only one way in and out. A lot of people wanted to, and we struggled with that on the design side, and I'm one of these guys that doesn't like to duplicate my walks. I want to do a circle walk. But the experience of this project was to come out and then into the valley and then come back up, and now you're facing the building this way, and you get somewhat of the same view that you get with the car that you're coming in on that axis. And now all of a sudden you're experiencing this entry into the north-south axis, whereas before you were entering on the east-west axis. So even though you don't realize it, you've become part of the four cardinal points just by experiencing the site.
The medicine wheel in the park is the most northerly location of a medicine wheel anywhere on the northern plains. And medicine wheels are a northern plains phenomena. There are probably about 200 of them known. This would be in southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, Montana, Wyoming, and maybe a scattering of them in adjacent states. But
Yeah, the medicine wheel, this is one of the further north ones. And I know that it's part of our history, the Dakota history, so it's part of it's a service where they conduct ceremonies, very sacred sites. You know? So we always make offerings there, like here, to offer tobacco.
the question is, why is that medicine wheel here? It's here because people camped here. This is a good buffalo hunting area. People are going to be spending considerable amounts of time here. And of course, you're going to start to see that more special ceremonial or that type of site that has a greater social significance.
For the scale of it, you know, only $3.5 million. It's not a big project by any means, but I think one that is really a resource and a gem for Saskatoon.
Does the building work? Yes, although it's too small. I like to think in Saskatchewan we have great ideas, but we rarely have the money to do it.
Well, the current building's about 33,000 square feet. We're going to add about 10,000 square feet. And we're going to develop 2 new galleries. One we call permanent exhibitions, where we will have the 7 tribal leader concept, because our people have had very structured societies for thousands of years. We're all very different. We aren't one great tribal group. We're seven nations of people, so we want to tell our stories differently.
We got to expand and renew the interpretive part, because we've learned, and then there's history, like there's more and more history written on First Nations people, and more relevant stuff, you know. And then what do we show? Like what happened to the bison, you know, and the reasons for it. You know, really, we just have very short pieces of it there. The economics at that time, you know, way back, and we want to, you know, have a better history of our people, you know, from kind of a chronological from there and what happened, what, you know, with the residential school systems and the determination policies that the government, you know, assimilation, what's those other words that you're trying to get rid of all First Nations people. You know, that it's there, and we didn't want to tell it the first time, but we have to tell it because that's part of history. You know?
We're also building a new temporary exhibit gallery. We have an art gallery currently, but it doesn't meet world standards, and we can't bring in fabulous displays from places like the National Museum of the American Indian, the Royal Sask Museum, the Canadian Museum of Civilization. So we want to be able to answer the question, what is new at Wanuskewin, and expand the knowledge that we offer to people.
So we're looking at some major reconfiguration. I think that's just an example of Wanuskewin's success, however, that you know, many of these interpretive centers, cultural facilities, they're expensive to run, and here we are all these years later, and we're looking at expansion. So it works. It could be bigger. I don't think it could be much better.
We get a chance maybe once every 2-3 years to do something really, really special. Now, we don't get a chance. This is a once-in-a-lifetime building, this one. You don't get a chance to work with all of these different groups on a World Heritage Site maybe ever again. So this is not very special. But every 2 or 3 years, you'll get to do something that's really pretty neat. Maybe not World Heritage status like this one is, but this was pretty special.
when school kids come down here and I ask them about archaeology, one of the common themes has been, well, we won't dig. We won't have to dig. We'll have probes that we stick into the ground, which will immediately give us a readout of everything that's underneath there. Kids these days think in different kinds of terms, and it's usually electronics. So if somebody finds the remains of the interpretive center in the future, it will be concrete and wires and plastic, a lot of kind of preserved material. We're building massive archaeological sites that will have tremendous durability, unlike the site that we're sitting on right now.
I, a few years ago, went on a trip to Crete, and I was climbing up these old temple ruins and thinking, wow, 1500 BC, this place is old. And then I realized I work at a place that's much older with a much greater, richer history, and that's something we have to preserve and be proud of and go forward with.
I think the real benefit to Wanuskewin, my personal opinion here is, though, that it's telling the story of our First Nations people before the arrival of Europeans, and if anything, it tends to bring the two communities, the First Nations and the non-First Nations community, together. So it's a social benefit, I think, that is perhaps the most important.
My dream, I guess, is that this Wanuskewin Heritage Park, the area, what it's done and what it means, would carry on to the world, you know, because when we have our ceremonies June 21st, we are praying for world peace. There's so much turmoil in the world, and it's not supposed to be. We're not supposed to be living that way, and in our culture, like in our history, we never lived in turmoil. We always lived with the nature, with Mother Earth, and we give and take, you know, and that's the way the world is supposed to be. And it's not. And that's our kind of goal, is to see the world peace and everybody live in harmony, you know.